Today we are going to be going over modules 70 to 74. We will be talking about social psychology. Social psychology is one of my favorite chapters in this whole textbook. I know you've heard me say, oh, this is my favorite chapter, but really and truly, social psychology is one of my favorite chapters or modules in the textbooks. We will be covering a ton of information, and I think it's all interesting information. Some of it will be new to you, a lot of key terms that you may not have heard of, but I think it's very interesting, and we'll hear a lot about different experiments in this chapter, a lot of unethical experiments that we will be going over. So let's go ahead and start Module 70. So this is over social behavior and cognition. So humans and social context. Social psychology is the study of how individuals think and behave in social situations. There is a fascinating effect between our behavior and the people around us. So we are born into organized societies. There are values in our world. There's expectations and behavior patterns that are established in the society that we live in. Culture is an ongoing pattern of life that is passed from one generation to the next generation. To appreciate culture and society, we need to think about how we've been affected by language, marriage customs, concepts of ownerships, sex roles. So we all belong to social roles. Social roles are expected behavior associated with social positions, like being a son, being a daughter, being a student, being a worker. All those are different roles that we are expected to be when we are in those roles. So playing these roles involve different sets of behaviors and expectations. Some roles are ascribed roles and some are achieved roles. Ascribed roles are assigned to us, like being male or female, being a son or a daughter, or even being a teenager. Achieved roles are voluntary attained by special effort, like being a spouse, being a teacher, being a criminal, being a band leader. Many people experience role conflicts in which two or more roles make conflicting demands on them. So, like being a mother and having a demanding job. If you are a mom and you have a full-time job that's very demanding, that's conflicting because you have a family to take care of, but you also have that job to take care of as well. So that is an example of conflicting roles, and a lot of people have those conflicting roles in their lives. There are two important dimensions on any group, of any group. One is structure and one is cohesiveness. So group structure consists of the networks of roles, communication pathways, and power in a group. Organized groups like the army or athletic teams have a high degree of structure. Group cohesiveness refers to the degree of attraction among group members or the strength of the desire to remain in the group. Groups that are cohesive tend to stick together. They stand up together, they sit together, they pay more attention to one another, and they show more mutual affection. And they tend to be closely coordinated to one another. Cohesiveness is strong for in-groups. In-groups are groups with which a person identifies. Your own in-groups are defined by a combination of social dimensions like nationality, ethnicity, education, income, religion, sexual orientation. So in-groups help define who we are socially, and they also tend to attribute positive characteristics to our in-groups and negative qualities to out-groups. Out-groups are the groups we don't belong to or that we do not identify with. We tend to exaggerate differences between members of the out-groups and our own groups. A person's social position within groups affects his or her prestige and dominance in those groups. Social status is the degree of prestige, admiration, respect, according to the members of the group. Social power is a degree to which a person possesses the capacity to control the behavior of other group members. Men usually prefer social power over status, while women generally prefer status over power. Having a higher status, having a higher power can both lead to privileges. In one experiment, a man walked into several bakeries and asked for a pastry while claiming he didn't have enough money to pay for it. So half the time he was dressed well and the rest of the time he was dressed poorly. If the man was polite when he asked, he was equally given a free pastry no matter how he was dressed. But if he was impolite and rude when he asked, he was much less likely to get a pastry if he was poorly dressed than if he was well dressed. When we are affected by group norms, a norm is a widely accepted, often not spoken of, standard for appropriate behavior. The impact of norms was shown in a study of littering. So the question of the study was, does the amount of trash in an area affect littering? People were given flyers as they walked into a public parking garage. The more litter there was on the ground, the more likely people were to add to it by dropping their flyer. So the moral of this story is that the cleaner a public area is kept, the less likely people are to trash it. Social comparisons. Social psychologist Leon Festinger claim that group membership feels needs for social comparison, which is comparing your own actions, feelings, opinions, or abilities to others. Have you ever compared notes with another students after taking an exam? If you have satisfied that need for social comparisons. And we don't make social comparisons randomly. Meaningful evaluations are based on comparing yourself with people of similar backgrounds, abilities, and circumstances. Thinking of yourself as successful, talented, responsible, or fairly paid depends entirely on whom you choose to compare yourself with. So every day we must guess how people will act. We do this by the form of social cognition called attribution. As we observe others, we make attributions about them. So, for example, and your book talks about Tom Hanks. In 2013, Tom Hanks was the most trusted person in the U.S. according to Reader Digest poll. Is he that trustworthy? Or has he played many trustworthy characters in the films? Most of us personally don't know Tom Hanks, so we don't know how he is in real life. We've watched him on different films or movies, so we kind of know his characters on those films and movies, but most of us don't know him in real life. We are prone to attribute to actors their personality traits of the characters that they play. This is called fundamental attribution error. We tend to think about the actions of others have internal causes, even if they are caused by external forces or circumstances. So we don't know Tom Hanks in a personal way. We probably never sat down with him. We never probably talked to him. But we think we know him. He was rated the most trustworthy person, probably due to his characters on the films, on the movies that we have seen, even though probably very few people really know him on a personal level. If that doesn't make sense, let me know and I will explain it some other way. When we think about our behavior, we're more likely to think of that external causes explain our actions. An actor-observer bias is present in how we explain behavior. As observers, we attribute the behavior of others to their wants, motives, and personality traits. As actors, we tend to find external explanations for our own behaviors. So, for example, you might think that people don't leave tips at a restaurant because they're cheapskates. If you don't leave a tip, then the service was bad. Another example is people are always late because they are irresponsible. But if you are late, it's because you were held up by events beyond your control. So you kind of have an excuse to your behavior. We can explain our behavior because it's our own self. But if somebody else is late, you think they're very irresponsible. But yet, if you're late, you have a reason. You are held up by events beyond your control. Same thing with the tipping. If someone else doesn't leave a tip, you probably don't think, oh, the service was bad or whatever. Um, you're gonna have a irrational thought. They're cheapskates. They just want out of it. They don't. They're gonna pay for their meal, but they're not gonna leave a tip because they're cheapskates. If you don't leave a tip, it's because it was bad service. So you have an excuse for yourself, whereas the behaviors of others, their wants, their motives, their personality traits, that doesn't have an excuse for you. Again, if this doesn't make sense, please let me know and I'll explain it another way. Attitudes. Our taste, our friendships, votes, preferences, goals, and all the behaviors that we have are touched by attitudes. The attitude is a positive or negative perception of people, objects, or issues. Attitudes summarize your evaluations of objects. Attitudes are expressed through beliefs, emotions, and actions. The belief component of an attitude is what you believe about particular objects or issues. The emotional component consists of your feelings toward an attitudinal object. And the action component refers to your actions toward various people, objects, or institutions. So, for an example, your attitude toward gun control. You have beliefs about whether gun control would affect rates of crime and violence. You will respond emotionally towards guns, finding them attractive and desirable, or you find them threatening and destructive. And the action component of your attitude may include that you support organizations that urge gun control or you oppose gun control altogether. So how do we acquire attitudes? Sometimes attitudes come from personal experience. Some attitudes are simply formed through chance conditioning, learning that takes place by luck or coincidence. For example, if you 3 encounters with a psychologist, then they were negative encounters, then you have a view of psychology as being bad and not interesting. So, for example, you had 3 encounters with a psychologist, and they were very negative encounters. You did not enjoy the psychologist. You didn't enjoy any experiences with the psychologist. Then you're going to view psychology as being bad or not interesting at all. You'll probably never want to come in contact with a psychologist again. I hope that clears up that how we acquire attitudes. So a lot of attitudes come from personal experiences. People develop strong attitudes about foods, different cities, even parts of the country due to having good or bad experiences. Attitude is learned through interaction with others. Our attitudes are influenced by group members. Child rearing also affects attitudes. So if both parents are Republican, chances are that the child will be a Republican too, or will belong to the Republican Party. That doesn't always happen, but yeah, it does. It definitely does happen. Especially when you're younger, you really look up to your parents. Your parents teach you and guide you. They interact with you, and that's what you view. And when you get older and go to college, you may start to belong to the Democrat Party. You may stick to your ways as a Republican, but you may view the world in another way. Your attitudes can change with time, with different friends. So yeah, you can definitely change the party or change whatever because of your attitudes. Attitudes are influenced by media as well. Young people today spend at least 50 hours a week immersed in media like TV, playing video games, watching movies, getting on the internet, listening to music. So that all changes your attitudes. Attitude change. So attitude is fairly stable, but they do change throughout the lifespan. Some attitude change can be understood through a reference group. A reference group is any group that an individual uses as a standard for social comparison. It is not necessary to have face-to-face contact with other people for them to be in a reference group. So in the 1930s, Theodore Newcomb studied real-life attitude changes among the students at Bennington College. So most of these students came from conservative homes, but Bennington was a very liberal school. He found that most students shifted significantly toward more liberal attitudes during their 4 years at Bennington College. Those who didn't change kept their parents and hometown friends as primary reference groups. Those who did change identified primarily with the campus community. So really living on campus and not being at home as much or keeping your hometown friends can change your way of thinking, really. College definitely changes a lot of people's thinking. It did when I went to college, for sure. It changed my attitude. It helped me grow as a person. I've changed a lot since high school because of college. College had changed my whole perspective. I learned a whole new world is out there due to college. Persuasion is any deliberate attempt to change attitudes or beliefs through information and arguments. Businesses, politicians, there's a lot of people that try to persuade us. Lots of money go into advertising for persuasion. So persuasion can range from daily media commercials to personal discussions with friends. Lots of TV commercials. Lots of TV commercials have different songs or little jingles that will persuade you. They're very catchy jingles, but and if you watch it so much, you'll know. But they can definitely persuade you into thinking, oh, that's what I need, that's what I want. So what happens if people act in ways that are inconsistent with their attitudes or self-image? Cognitions are thoughts, and dissonance means clashing. This theory is called cognitive dissonance. It states that contradicting or inconsistent thoughts causes a psychological state of discomfort. We need to have consistency in our lives, and we want that consistency in our lives. Inconsistency can motivate people to make their thoughts and attitudes agree with their actions. For example, smokers are told on every pack of cigarettes endangers their lives. They still light it up and smoke, though. They could quit smoking, but it may be easier to convince them that smoking is really not so dangerous. So how would we do that? A smoker might seek examples of heavy smokers who have lived long lives. They may spend time with other smokers, and they may avoid the information about the links of smoking and cancer. So according to the cognitive dissonance theory, we tend to reject new information that contradicts ideas that we already hold. Moving on to Module 71, this is about social influence. The heart of social psychology is social influence. Social influence is changes in behavior induced by the actions of others. When people interact, they almost always affect one another's behavior. For one example, in one study, various numbers of people stood on a busy New York City street. On cue, they all looked at the sixth floor window across the street. A camera recorded how many passerbyers also stopped to stare. The larger the influencing group, the more people were swayed to join in staring at the windows. And there are different types of social influences. There's mere presence, conformity, compliance, obedience, and coercion. And we will talk about all these different social influences as well. Mere presence. That's a tendency for people to change their behavior just because of the presence of others. So, for example, if you were in a room all alone, picking your nose, would you continue picking your nose if another person walks in? Hopefully you wouldn't. But that's an example of mere presence. Imagine you are pedaling your bike when another rider pulls up beside you. Would you speed up, slow down, or completely ignore the other rider? So in 1898, a psychologist, Norman Triplett, did an investigation on this. So according to him, we would all speed up. This is called social facilitation, which is a tendency to perform better when in the presence of others. Does mere presence always improve behavior? Not always. If you are confident in your abilities, your behavior will most likely be facilitated in the presence of others. If you are not confident, your performance is more likely to be impaired. Another study focused on college students shooting pool. Good players are confident, normally made 71% of their shots. Their accuracy improved 80% when others were watching them. Less confident average players, who normally made 36% of their shots, dropped to 25% accuracy when someone is watching them. I personally do not like people over my shoulder watching me do something, especially taking a test. I would be the one where it would drop because of my ability level. Even if I knew all the subject very well, I feel like I would still drop because I don't like someone watching over my shoulder the whole time. Just the mere presence of somebody does definitely change your behavior. Social loafing is also in this. This is another consequence of having people nearby. People tend to exert less effort when they are part of a group than they do when they're solely responsible for their work. In one study, people playing tug of war while blindfolded pulled harder if they thought they were competing alone. When they thought others were on a team, they made less of an effort. I'm sure all of you have experienced social loafing in some type of way. This is one reason I don't like group work. I'm sure in high school or even in college classes, you have some kind of group activity or a group paper to do. You'll experience that one person that doesn't do anything. They don't put any effort in that group project or whatever you're doing. They don't put any effort. That is social loafing. That's a very good way of explaining social loafing. Conformity is matching behavior and appearance to perceived social norm. One of the first studies done on conformity was staged by Solomon Asch. Imagine yourself as a participant. Assume that you are seated at a table with 6 other students. Your task is quite simple. You are shown 3 lines on a card, just like the 3 lines on the PowerPoint. You must select the line that matches a standard line. As the testing begins, each person announces an answer for the first card. When your turn comes, you agree with the others. You tell yourself, this isn't hard at all, this is easy. And so you get along and you keep doing a few cards, and then comes a shock. All 6 people announce that line 1 matches the standard line, and you are about to say line 2 matches the standard line. Suddenly you feel alone, you feel upset, you start to get nervous, you start to look at the lines again, and then the room becomes very silent. They're waiting for you to answer. Everyone seems to be staring at you. thinking probably in their heads, hey, you need to hurry up answering this question or this card. The experimenter awaits your answers. Do you yield to the group? Do you personally yield to the group? In the study, the other students were all actors who gave the wrong answer on about a third of the trials to create group pressure. Real students conformed to the group about one third of the time. Of those tested, 75% yielded at least once. People who were tested alone made a mistake less than 1%. People with high needs in structure or certainty are more likely to conform. So are people who are anxious, low in self confidence, or concerned with the approval of others. People who lived in cultures that emphasize group cooperation are also more likely to conform. If we were sitting in class, I would ask how many people would conform. Some of y'all may not think that y'all might conform. It depends really if you're in that situation. I would tell you for myself, I probably would conform because I would be concerned about the approval of others. I would also be very anxious that I had another answer in my head, but everyone else is saying something totally different. More than likely, I would conform just to fit in. I never did like to stand out. Most people are that way. Most people don't want to stand out. Most people would try to conform. Again, I have a lot of students like, oh, I would not do that, but you really have to be in the situation to know if you would or not. So I want to show you a video on this. So let's watch a video on this study.
Okay, I want to give you a test of your visual acuity, your sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is, tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to agree with, to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1. They must be right.
There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1. 2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
If you have any questions about this video, please don't hesitate to ask. Let's move on to groupthink. It is a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. So group members are hesitant to rock the boat. They're hesitant to question sloppy thinking or even tolerate alternative views. Groupthink has been blamed for many things, like in the failure of Penn State University administrators to deal with appropriately a long-standing pattern of child sexual abuse by the football coach Jerry Sandusky. If you have never heard of Jerry Sandusky, and I would have to look the dates on this, I'm not quite sure, but for 14 years, Jerry Sandusky raped boy children for 14 years. And he was a football coach at Penn State. And for 14 years, he did this. There were people that knew he did this. But they kept their mouth shut. They did not want to rock the boat. But they knew what was happening. And they yet did anything about it. This is a great example of groupthink. There may be something going on in your group that's not right, that is not appropriate, but you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to make the group fall apart. You are just going to go ahead and go on with your life and pretend everything's okay. That is groupthink. We can prevent groupthink by define each group member's roles as a critical evaluator. We can avoid revealing any personal preferences in the beginning, so you state the problem without bias. You can invite a group member or outside person to play devil's advocate. You can make it clear that group members will be held accountable for their decisions. And then you can encourage asking questions and search for different alternative solutions. Compliance. One person bends to the request of another person who has little or no authority. You passively comply when, for example, someone's smoking near you in a no smoking zone, or when someone is talking loudly while you are trying to study in the library. You actively comply when you hand off your cell phone to a stranger who asks to make a call or lend money to a coworker who requests to buy something. When we are more likely to comply with a request if it does three things. If it comes from someone we know rather than a stranger, if it is consistent with our previous actions and allows us to reciprocate a prior gift, favor, or service. So strangers have to work harder to gain compliance. Salespeople depend heavily on appealing to your tendency to be consistent and to also reciprocate. So people who sell door to door have long recognized that once they get a foot in the door, a sale is almost a sure thing. So a foot in the door effect is a person who first agrees to a small request and is more likely to comply with a larger demand. So, for example, if you ask your best friend to borrow $10 and they give you that $10, you may come back in a couple weeks or a couple months and ask for $25. Well, you know they gave you $10 in the first place, so why would they not get you more money in the next couple weeks or in months or whatever? Free trial memberships is an example of foot in the door. So you can have it free for a couple weeks. And then once you got your foot in the door, then they're going to start charging you money. Another effect of compliance is door in the face. So this is a tendency for a person who has refused a major request to agree with a smaller request. So for example, your neighbor asks you to come feed his dog, water his plant, mow his yard while he's out of town for the whole month. You turn it down because it's a pretty big request. It's for the whole month. You would have to go every single day to feed his dog and maybe even to water his plants. So you turn it down and then you feel guilty that you turned him down, that you can't. What if the same neighbor returns the next day and asks you if you would just pick up his mail while he's gone? Chances are you probably would pick up his mail. You would be willing to do that. So at first it was a big major request and then it turned into a smaller request. That's a door in the face. Another effect or technique is the lowball technique. It consists of getting a person committed to an act and making the terms of acting less desirable. So, for example, if your friend asks for you to give them a ride to school in the morning, okay, you agree. I can give you a ride to school in the morning. After you agree, they tell you that they have to be at school at 6 a.m. So yeah, that would be a low ball. So you already agreed, and that's an okay thing. But after you agree, they say, hey, I have to be there at 6. So that means you have to get up early. It's less desirable after making the contract terms. Car dealership is another example of a lowball technique. You get a great deal on a car that you can't live without, only to find out the original price has been upped after you sign the papers. They're always doing that. That is how they get you in the door, kind of thing. That's the lowball. You can get so many thousands off on this car, but eventually you sign the papers and taxes has been added up and everything's been added up and maybe you got some good deals on it and maybe you upped in like the radio and whatever. The original price that you previously said, yes, I'll buy it, is not that. It's way more than expected. That is the lowball technique. Obedience. So if you're ordered to do so, would you shock a man with a heart condition who is screaming and asked to be released? Stanley Milgram in 1965 began to study obedience. Obedience is a compliance with a request from an authority figure. So imagining answering a newspaper ad to take part in a learning experiment at Yale University. So when you arrive, a coin is flipped, and the second participant, a pleasant-looking man that's in his 50s, is designated as the learner. You have become the teacher. Your task is to read aloud a list of word pairs. The learner's task is to memorize them. You are to punish him by using electric shock. The learner is taken to a nearby room, and you watch as he is seated in an electric chair. Electrodes are placed on his wrist, and then you're escorted to your position in front of the shock generator. On this device is a row of 30 switches marked from 15 to 450 volts. The labels range from slight shock to extreme intensity shock to danger severe shock. So your instructions are to shock the learner each time he makes a mistake. You begin at 15 volts and move up one switch higher for each additional mistake. The experiment begins and the learner soon makes a mistake. You flip the switch. More mistakes are made. You reach 75 volts pretty darn fast. The learner moans after each shock. At 100 volts, he complains that he has a heart condition. At 150 volts, he says he no longer wants to continue and demands to be released. At 300 volts, he screams and he says he no longer can give answers. So at some point, you begin to protest to the experimenter. You tell him, hey, he has a heart condition. I'm not going to kill the man. The experimenter says, please continue. Another shock, another scream from the learner, and you say, you mean I got to keep going up the scale? No, sir. I'm not going to give him 450 volts. The experimenter looks at you and says, the experiment requires that you continue. For a time, the learner refuses to answer any more questions and screams with each shock. Then he falls silent for the rest of the experiment. So this is kind of how the experiment goes. Stanley Milgram that did the experiment, he doubted that people would even obey his disorders. He polled a group of psychiatrists, and they predicted about less than 1% would actually obey this experiment. But the reality of this experiment is that 65% obeyed completely by going all the way to 450 volts. Virtually no one stopped at the 300 volts. The 300 volts was labeled severe shock. Now, is that not shocking to you? It's crazy to think that people would even obey those disorders. The learner was actually an actor who turned on a tape recorder on and off in the shock room. No shocks were ever administered, but the teacher's dilemma, which would be you in this aspect, was very real. The teacher's participants protested, they were sweating, they were trembling, they stuttered, they bit their lips, and they laughed very nervously. They were disturbed by what they were doing. But, again, most of them obeyed the experimenter's orders. So why did so many people obey? Some may think it was because it was at Yale University. There's a prestige that goes on with Yale University. Another possibility is that they assumed the professor running the experiment would really not allow anyone to hurt or anyone to be hurt. So the study was done in an off. The study was the same study was done, but it was kind of like a rerun trial of the study. Was done in an office building near Bridgeport, Connecticut. The office building was not prestigious at all, like Yale University. It was it wasn't run down, but it didn't look in the nicest condition. So under these conditions, fewer people obeyed. 48% obeyed compared to the 65%. But the reduction was relatively minor. So most people still obeyed the experimenter, even in an old office building. So Stanley Milgram, who did the experiment, was very disturbed by what he found out. He was disturbed by the willingness of people that let the authority control them. So in later experiments, he tried to reduce obedience. He found that the distance between the teacher and the learner was very, very important. When participants were in the same room as the learner, only 40% obeyed to the fullest amount. When they were face to face with the learner, they were required to force his hand down on a simulated shot plate, and only 30% obeyed. When the experimenter gave his orders over the phone, over 22% obeyed. Psychologist Jerry Berger of Santa Clara University replicated the study again in 2009, and he really found out the same kind of results. Again, most people are willing to obey just from one room to the next room. I think there was a curtain in between them, really, in this experiment. They couldn't see each other the first time they did it. So it wasn't too far off from the original experiment done by Stanley Milgram. Milgram's research raises questions about our willingness to commit antisocial or inhumane acts commanded by legitimate authority. Excuses like "I was only following orders" take on a whole new meaning. Milgram suggested that when directions come from authority, people rationally that they are not personally responsible for their own actions. In everyday life, crimes of obedience are very common. In order to keep jobs, many people obey orders to do things they know are dishonest or even unethical or even harmful. Before we go on to Philip Zimbardo's experiment, I want to show you a video of Milgram's experiment. I think this is very interesting that we are so obedient to a person in a lab coat. Just take a watch of this video.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area. They were obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. The subjects range in occupation from corporation presidents to good humormen and plumbers, and in educational level from one who had not finished elementary school to subjects who have doctorate and other professional degrees.
Now, both of you have been paid, so let me sit right down. So let me say that the checks are yours simply for showing up at the lab. And from this point on, no matter what happens, the money is yours. I should like to tell both of you a little about the memory project. Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn various types of material. Some of the better-known theories are treated in the book over there, The Teaching Learning Process by Cantor. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. A common application of this theory would be when parents spank a child who does something wrong. But actually, we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning because almost no truly scientific studies have been made of it in human beings. For instance, we don't know how much punishment is best for learning. And we don't know how much difference it makes as to who's giving the punishment, whether an adult learns best from an older or a younger person himself, and many things of this sort. So what we're doing in this project is bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages, and we're asking some of them to be teachers and some to be learners. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher here this afternoon, and the other to be the learner. This machine generates electric shocks, and when you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock. When you release it, the shock stops, you see, like that. The switch will remain in this middle position after you released it to show you which switches you've used on the board. Of course, if you were to press any one of them again, the learner would get another shock.
All subjects are given identical instructions and the sample shock.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of volts you receive in the sample shock. Do not open your eyes until I tell you to do so, please. Close them now. Okay, you may open your eyes, and using the voltage scale here, would you estimate for me the number of volts you received, please? You may also use the verbal designations, slight, moderate, strong, so forth, to help you. A number, please. Would you?
About 75.
75. No, actually, it was 45 here. Although it may have seemed stronger because of the electrode paste, which provides a perfect contact. All right, let's go on to our instructions. We will begin with this test. You will read each pair of words in this list once to the learner until you've read through the entire list. Direct your voice toward that microphone as the rooms are partially soundproof. After you've read through the list once, you will go on to the next page. And here, starting from line A, you'll read the word in large letters, along with each of the other words in the line. For example, in the first line, you read blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Now, after you've read the four choices, the learner pushes one of the switches on the board in front of him, and the number he has selected will light up in this box, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, if he gives the correct answer, you say correct and go on to the next line. The correct answer is underlined and is also indicated in the right margin.
Yeah.
If he were to indicate the wrong answer, you would say wrong. Then tell him the number of volts you're going to give him. Then give him the punishment. Then read the correct word pair once. And then go on to the next line. For example, if he indicated 3 for blue, you would say wrong. 15 volts. You press and release the switch. Read blue girl, and then go on to the next line.
I see.
Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator.
I see.
And it's important that you follow this procedure exactly. So to help you, let me go through it again very quickly. I would suggest you read the list and the test at a brisk pace to keep it moving.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The drawing was rigged so that the naive subject was always the teacher, and the accomplice always became the learner.
Of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end? And Mr. Wallace were out there, and say Mr. Williams, for some reason or other, said, keep going.
You're asking me how many?
Out of 100, right?
Well, personally, I think if you get 1 or 2, you'd be lucky.
Well, I'm not sure lucky is the right word.
40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school were also asked to predict the performance of 100 hypothetical subjects. They predicted that only a little more than 1/10 of 1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obeyed the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
165 volts. Time.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know. You have a heart condition then. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Yes, please. Wrong. That's almost 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're going to get a shock. 180 volts. You can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. You hear him hollering? He's
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I'd
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. He's under hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here. Geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. Who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedure as you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, read the correct answer. Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Grave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please, the 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the experiment.
But what if something's happened to the man, had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there. Some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please
I
continue.
don't tend to be rude, but I think you should look in on him.
Whether
all you got to do is look at the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, 450 volts. Next one is short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time.
All right, excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may.
How do you feel, though?
I feel all right, but I don't like what's happened to that fellow in there. He's been hollering, and we had to keep giving him shocks. I didn't like that one bit. He wanted to get out, and he just kept going, kept throwing 450 volts. I didn't like that. He wouldn't even look at him, that gentleman.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said, he's got to keep going. I told him it's time we stopped when we got up to 195, 210 volts.
But why didn't you just stop?
He wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop.
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
If you have any questions over the video, let me know. I think it's very interesting. I would love to discuss it with you. Let's move on to Zimbardo's prison experiment. So this is not mentioned in your book. I used to teach about it. It used to be in your book when I taught Psych classes at Hill College, but it's been taken out of the textbooks. And I had wondered why it was taken out of the textbooks, but and we'll talk about why it was taken out of the textbooks just recently, really. But I wanted to talk about it because I think it's very interesting. This is one experiment that really got me into psychology. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about it. So Philip Zimbardo in 1971 wanted to gain insight about the behavior of prisoners and guards in real prisons. So he and his colleagues at Stanford University simulated prison in the basement of the psychology building. He recruited 21 psychologically healthy male college students and randomly assigned 10 of them to be prisoners and 11 to be guards. The prisoners were held captive in the basement prison around the clock for 2 weeks. The guards were to serve duty in the prison on an 8-hour daily shifts. There were always 3 guards at the prison at any given time, and the pay was only $15 a day. Now you have to think, this is 1971, so that was pretty good pay for that. Zimbardo and his colleagues arranged a real police to pick up the prisoners at their homes at certain times. They charged them, they handcuffed them, they searched them, they took them down to a police station, they fingerprinted them, put them in the detention cell, put them in a blindfold to take them to the mock prison. So once at the fake prison, the prisoners were stripped, sprayed with deodorant spray, and made to stand alone naked for a while in the cell. Each prisoner was given a uniform consisting of a loose smock with an identifying number on the front and back. A chain and lock were placed around one ankle, and their hair was covered with nylon stockings. So throughout the experiment, the guards wore reflective sunglasses so the prisoners could not see their eyes. So prior to the experiment, Zimbardo told the guards, "We cannot physically abuse or torture them. We can create boredom. We can create a sense of frustration. We can create fear in them to some degree. They will have no privacy at all. There will be constant surveillance. Nothing to do will go unobserved. They will have no freedom of action. They will be able to do nothing and say nothing that we don't permit. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. They're going to be wearing uniforms, and at no time will anyone call them by name. They will have numbers and be called only by their numbers. We have total power of this situation." Zimbardo acted as a prison superintendent. During this time in the 70s, there were many news reports about the prison riots and brutality of guards. So this question, this experiment was an invalid research about what they were supposed to do. The prisoners, what did they do? They sat around, they just kind of talked pleasantly with one another. So there's no validity in this experiment. That is one reason that it is taken out of the textbook, because there's no validity of this experiment. There's no research done on this experiment. There's nothing that says, hey, this is a great experiment by any means. So they had different jobs. So it was clearly they acted like prisoners, or they clearly acted like guards. Or they were to act out their stereotypes. So what were the results? The guards behaved toward the prisoners in negative, hostile, and dehumanizing ways. The prisoners behaved in rebellious and passive ways. At one point on the second day, they ripped off their clothing and identification numbers while shouting curses at the guards. Later, 5 prisoners reacted with such extreme emotions that they were removed from the study before the end of the 5 days. By the 6th day, the behavior of prisoners and guards had spiraled to a point that Zimbardo decided to stop it. The articles that I've read that Zimbardo would have been disappointed if they had sat around and talked pleasantly. That's not what he wanted them to do, according to these articles. Much of the research has shown that participants in psychological experiments are highly motivated to do what they believe the researchers want them to do. So, in my research of this Stanford prison experiment and why it was out of the textbooks, I found this statement of this. It was in an issue of Stanford Alumni magazine from 2011. One of the guards of the experiment stated this: "During the day shift when I worked, no one did anything that was beyond you'd expect in that situation. But Zimbardo went out of his way to create tension. Things like forced sleep deprivation. He was really pushing the envelope. I just didn't like the whole idea of constantly disturbing people and asking them to recite their prisoner numbers and count. I certainly didn't like when they put a guy in solitary confinement. I didn't think it was ever meant to go on for full 2 weeks. I think Zimbardo wanted to create a dramatic crescendo and end it as quickly as possible. I felt that throughout the experiment, he knew what he wanted and then he tried to shape the experiment. But how was it constructed? By how it was played out to fit the conclusion that he had already worked out. He wanted to be able to say that college students, people from middle class backgrounds, people will turn on each other just because they're given a role and given power. I don't think the actual events match up with the bold headlines." I do have a video that I want you to watch on this. I'm not going to show it. I'm going to have a link so you can watch it. It's about 30 minutes, which would make my video very, very long. But I'm going to put it out there so you can watch it. I think it's very interesting, and I think you will find it very interesting. The video does have curse words in it, and so it's kind of violent, but I think it's a very interesting video to watch. And it is a documentary. It was filmed back in 1971 while it was going on. So I think it's very interesting for you to watch. Let's move on with coercion. So this is being forced or to change your beliefs or your behaviors against your will. You might have heard of brainwashing. Brainwashing is a forced attitude change, requires a captive audience. If you are offended by a commercial, you can basically just ignore it. Prisoners are completely at the mercy of their captors. Brainwashing typically starts by making the target person feel completely helpless. Physical and psychological abuse, lack of sleep, humiliation, and isolation serve to unfreeze or loosen former values and beliefs. In most cases, the dramatic shift in attitudes brought on by brainwashing is just temporary. You can brainwash your children. You can brainwash them to like a certain thing. I had a cousin that we always said that his children were very brainwashed to go to Texas A&M. He and his ex-wife now, but they were both A&M people. They loved A&M with all their heart, and their children were very brainwashed to go to A&M. That's all they talked about. His son would say, "Longhorns stink." He hates the color orange. He loved the color maroon. So we always said that he brainwashed his son. So that's another example of brainwashing. In this brainwashing coercion is a cult. A cult is a group that professes great devotion to some person and follows that person almost without question. So one example of a cult is the People's Temple. On November 18, 1978, in what became known as Jonestown Massacre, more than 900 members of an American cult called the People's Temple died in a mass suicide murder under the direction of their leader, Jim Jones. This mass suicide murder took place at the so-called Jonestown settlement in the South American nation of Guyana. Jones had found that what became of the People's Temple in India in the 1950s, then relocated to his congregation to California in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, they moved to the South American nation of Guyana. He promised that they would establish a utopian community, and about some thousand people followed him to this jungle so they could live in a utopian type of community. On November 18, 1978, U.S. Representative Leo Ryan, who had gone to Jonestown to investigate claims of abuse, was murdered, along with 4 members of his delegation, by Jonestown gunmen. That same day, Jones ordered all his followers to drink a grape-flavored aid laced with poison, while armed guards stood by. All of those people, or most of those people, drank that grape-flavored juice or water that was laced with poison. I have a video for you to watch on this as well. I also have another one on David Koresh, which happened in Waco, Texas. It was called the Waco Siege. And so I'm not going to discuss it. I just want to show you the video. If you have any questions over it, let me know. These are cults. There are cults today. There are cults all over the world. But these are just some cults that you can watch about, and let me know if you have any questions over them.
Started as an effort by a charismatic preacher to build a new society, but it ended, of course, with the tragic deaths of more than 900 people. Here's NBC's Joe Fryer.
Jonestown was supposed to be a paradise in the South American jungle. It was anything but.
The saddest part about this tragedy is that good, decent people died who were well-intentioned.
The story begins in America during the 1970s when Jim Jones created a religious movement called People's Temple. The charismatic minister fought for civil rights and had a multiracial family.
It was the original Rainbow family,
including his adopted son, Jim Jones Jr.
Did his message at the time resonate with you?
Yes. No isms, no sexism, racism.
But in the new book, The Road to Jonestown, author Jeff Gwynne details how Jones started to change.
He's convinced himself that he is some sort of superhuman martyr.
Jones persuaded nearly 1,000 followers to move to a remote jungle in Guyana.
The concept was to build a new world.
A socialist utopia.
Jonestown was described as its paradise, and it was not.
Former member Leslie Wagner Wilson says followers were overworked and underfed.
And then as time wore on, I realized that there was no future in Jonestown. Jim became increasingly paranoid.
Jones was obsessed with revolutionary suicide. He felt followers should be prepared to die for their cause, even having them drink fruit punch he claimed was poison.
Only after most of the people drank the liquid did he tell them, it's not poison, I was just testing you.
In November 1978, a concerned congressman, Leo Ryan, flew to Guyana to investigate, accompanied by NBC News. While some followers praised Jonestown, others wanted out.
What is your wish today? To go back home. And where's home? U.S.
As the congressman left, he took 15 defectors with him, angering Jones.
People play games, friend. They lie. What can I do about lies? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us.
He ordered gunmen to follow the group to the nearby airstrip, where they opened fire. 5 were killed, including Congressman Ryan, NBC correspondent Don Harris, and cameraman Bob Brown. Sound engineer Steve Sung and field producer Robert Flick escaped, as did Ryan aide and future Congresswoman Jackie Spear. Back at the commune, Jones gathered his followers for a final sermon.
We've had as much of this world as you're going to get. Let's be done with it. Let's be done with the agony of it.
This time, Jones served a punch spiked with cyanide. More than 900 died, 300 of them children. Jones shot himself.
We know from autopsies conducted later that a considerable number of people were held and forcibly injected with the poison.
In the end, how many relatives did you lose?
I lost 11 relatives.
Wagner Wilson and her 3-year-old lived because they were part of a small group that escaped during the confusion that morning, hiking through more than 30 miles of dense jungle to safety.
How scared were you to try to escape?
I was terrified. I was waiting for a bullet to hit at any moment. I was prepared to die on that day.
I don't know how I can ever describe it in words.
Jim Jones Jr., 18 at the time, lost his wife, but he lived because he was in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, as part of his frequent public relations work for the temple.
So the million-dollar question is, would I have done it? I can't say I would, but I can't say I wouldn't have.
That shows how much power Jones had.
And part of that, I believe, is because we all are looking for a place to fit into the world. We're looking for love. We're looking for acceptance. And Jim Jones provided that.
Today, a memorial in Oakland serves as a remembrance for those who died, predominantly African Americans and the elderly, whom Jones's initial message resonated with.
I think the lessons of Jonestown is to really go within so you don't have to go without.
It's better to live for a cause than die for it.
Despite what happened, the minister's son still goes by the name Jim Jones Jr.
I'm proud of the upbringing and the education I was given. That's a lot to be proud of. I also have to accept the horrific tragedy that my father caused, but he caused it, not me.
For Today, Joe Fryer, NBC News.
Well, looking back, I remember the headlines around that time, and it was just, you almost couldn't even get your arms around the idea of what had happened there.
It's unfathomable. I don't think there's been anything like that since. It's just...
It's so many minors, over 300 children. Yeah.
So sad.
In 1993, Americans watched breathlessly as FBI agents faced off with a self-proclaimed religious prophet and his armed followers in Central Texas. This was the Waco siege, a weeks-long standoff between the federal government and a religious group known as the Branch Davidians. Established by leader Victor Hautef, the Branch Davidians are a Christian sect, an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, with a literal interpretation of the Bible's prophecies. Hautef and a group of his followers settled near Waco, Texas in 1935. Branch Davidians believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ and a day of judgment in which God will punish the wicked and reward the good. In preparation for Judgment Day, the Branch Davidians isolated themselves from the outside world in their commune near Waco. Confined to a 77-acre compound called the Mount Carmel Center, they established their own way of life. The group had gone through various divisions and changes in leadership before it was taken over by a charismatic Bible teacher named David Koresh in 1990. Koresh was a self-proclaimed prophet and believed that he was appointed by God to bring about the end of the world. Unlike his predecessors, Koresh practiced polygamy, taking a number of underage followers as wives who bore his children. He also collected guns and ammunition in preparation for the coming apocalypse. Word eventually reached federal authorities that the cult was illegally stockpiling weapons. February 28, 1993, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms arrived at the Mount Carmel compound, armed with search warrants for the property and an arrest warrant for Koresh. Gunfire erupted, although it's unclear which side started it. At the end of the 2-hour standoff, 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians were dead. The FBI intervened. Nearly 900 members of law enforcement descended on the compound, including Texas Rangers, Army personnel, and National Guardsmen. For weeks, FBI negotiators bargained with Koresh, bringing in supplies and allowing him to sermonize on the radio in a bid to get him to surrender. Though he allowed a number of Davidians to leave, Koresh displayed no signs of turning himself in. Agents then tried hardball tactics. They turned off the electricity, blasted loud music, and flashed harsh spotlights into the compound's windows. That didn't work either. After a 51-day standoff, Attorney General Janet Reno gave the FBI the green light to raid Mount Carmel. On April 19, 1993, tanks rolled in and punched holes in its walls and deposited nearly 400 canisters of tear gas inside the building. Several hours later, a fire broke out.
This far out in the country without fire hydrants, you have to haul all of your water. It's just a very bad scenario at this point.
Winds fanned the flames and reduced the entire property to ash within an hour. Around 80 Branch Davidians died, including David Koresh and 25 children. While most died from fire and smoke inhalation, 2 members were found with fatal bullet wounds to the head. 4 federal agents were also killed during that siege. Several months later, a federal grand jury indicted 12 of the surviving Branch Davidians for unlawful possession of firearms and aiding the murder of federal officers. Many believe the government's actions were overly aggressive and maybe even illegal. The raid drew sharp public criticism, and controversy swirled over whether or not federal agents started the fire and shot the Branch Davidians. At the center of the storm was Janet Reno, who issued the final order to raid the compound. In 1999, she appointed independent counsel John Danforth to investigate the incident. Danforth concluded that the agents were not responsible and placed the blame squarely on Koresh and his followers for setting the blaze and shooting themselves in order to fulfill their apocalyptic prophecy. The investigation failed to satisfy critics who, to this day, believe in conspiracy theories of a federal cover-up. For some right-wing extremist groups and patriot militias, Waco was further evidence of a government willing to use its power against its own people. One of these extremists was a 24-year-old disgruntled Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh. Radicalized by Waco, McVeigh would retaliate for what he saw as the injustices of the Waco siege by bombing a federal building in Oklahoma City, exactly 2 years to the day of the siege at Mount Carmel.
Moving on to Module 72. We're going to be talking about prosocial behavior. Affiliation and attraction. Prosocial behavior is any behavior that has a positive impact on other people. We are social beings. We need to affiliate. We need to have a need for association with another person. It is rooted in our human desires to get or to give approval, support, friendship, and love. We also had to affiliate to help us think about ourselves by comparing ourselves with other people. Interpersonal attraction is a social attraction to another person. This is the basis for most voluntary social relationships. To form friendships, we must first identify potential friends and then get to know them. Deciding whether you would like to get to know another person can happen quickly. Sometimes within just minutes of meeting, you decide that, hey, I want to get to know this person. Or you can decide, oh, I really don't want to know this person. So that's kind of your first impression of that person. So what initially attracts people to each other? There's been a lot of studies done, and these are the factors that influence our initial attraction. The first one is being familiar with that person. So we are attracted to people who we are familiar with. Our choices of friends, our lovers, are based more on physical proximity, like a nearness, than we may care to believe. Proximity promotes attraction by increasing the frequency of contact between people. The closer people live to each other, the more likely they are to become friends. Likewise for lovers. That's not always true, though. There are dating websites nowadays that we can meet people long distance. Long distance relationships can work, but it's very difficult for them to work. So yeah, I still agree with this, but yes, there are I still think this is number one thing. We do choose our friends, we do choose our lovers based on physical proximity, based on that nearness. But with times and how they're changing, dating websites have come along, and we can meet people from all over the world, and then we can even date people from all over the world. But it's still very hard to date people from another country or even another state or even 5 hours away. It would be a little bit harder than if they were like right next to us. Another one is similarity. Similar people are attracted to each other. Similarity refers to how alike you are to another person in background, age, sex, interests, attitudes, ethnicities, beliefs, and all the above. So if you think about your closest friends, are you similar to your closest friends? We also tend to choose a mate that is similar to us well. Studies have shown that married couples are highly similar in age, education, ethnicity, and religion. To a lesser degree, they may be similar in attitudes, opinions, mental abilities, status, height, weight. We need to be similar to our friends. We need to be similar to our lovers, even in a marriage. We just have to have something in common. I think you have to have at least one thing in common for it to work out. There's a saying that opposites attract. Yeah, that can be true, but you have to have something in common for it to work out. You cannot be totally opposite of each other for it to work out. You just have to have some kind of similarities, some kind of interest, and then that will work out. Physical attractiveness. Beautiful people are generally rated as more appealing than average. This is part of the halo effect. We assume that attractive people are also likable, intelligent, warm, witty, mentally healthy, and socially skilled. But in reality, physical attractiveness has little or no connection to intelligence, talents, abilities. Beauty affects mainly our initial interest in getting to know one another. Later, more meaningful qualities gain importance. So really that first thing is physical attractiveness. If you haven't seen the newest Netflix show, Love is Blind, I suggest you watch it. It's very, very interesting. These people get into pods. They don't get to see each other, and they get to know each other, not by looks, but just by talking to each other. And then in the end, some propose, some get married. It's a very interesting show. If you have not watched it, I recommend it. But physical attractiveness, I think, is that show says no. You don't have to see the beauty before you get to know that person. But I think that's one of our first things we look at. Are they physically attractive, especially for lovers, or for wanting to date a person? If they're not physically attractive of you, you probably won't ask them out. You probably won't even approach them in any direction. And then the last one is reciprocity. So this occurs when people respond to each other in similar ways. Maybe the most important factor influencing the development of relationships. We need to know if someone is interested in us as we are them. Reciprocity is a mutual exchange of feelings, thoughts, or things between people. So again, if we think they're interested in us, and we are definitely interested in them, that's reciprocity. There might be something going on. There may be something that can be happening. If we are interested in them and they're not interested in us, then there's not going to be any mutual exchange going on. Once initial contact has been made, then it's time to get to know each other. We do this by self-disclosing. We begin to share private thoughts, private feelings. We start to reveal ourselves to other people. And that disclosure requires a degree of trust. We're not going to talk about everything the first day we meet somebody. We're not going to share our private thoughts, our private feelings for for the most part, on the first day that we meet somebody. We usually tend to play it safe. And then as we start to get to know them, that's when we start to self-disclose. Interpersonal attraction. Robert Sternberg in 1988 developed a triangular theory of love. He said that different forms of love arise from different combinations of three basic components. So the first component is intimacy. So this refers to the feelings of connectedness and affection. The second is passion, refers to a deep emotional or sexual feelings. And then 3 is commitment. It involves a determination to stay in a long-term relationship with another person. And there are different forms of love. So here's the different kinds of forms of love. Non-love. This is the absence of all 3. There's no intimacy, there's no passion, and there's no commitment. Number 2 is liking. So in this relationship, intimacy or knowledge of other and a sense of closeness is present. Passion and commitment are not present. So it's just intimacy alone. Partners feel free to be themselves. They disclose personal information. They may feel that the other person knows them well and can be honest with them and let them know if they think the person is wrong. These partners are friends. However, being told that your partner thinks of you as a friend can be a devastating blow if you're attracted to them or you want to have a romantic relationship with them. Number 3 is infatuation. So perhaps this is Sternberg's version of love at first sight. Infatuation consists of immediate, intense physical attraction to somebody. A person who is infatuated finds it hard to think of anything but that other person. Brief encounters are played over and over in one's head, may be difficult to eat, and there may be a rather constant state of arousal. Infatuation is rather short-lived, however, lasting perhaps only matters a month, or maybe even long as a year, but it's still pretty short-lived. And it tends to be based on chemical attraction and an image of what one thinks the other is all about. So it's just love at first sight. Then we have fatuous love. However, some people have strong physical attraction push for commitment early in relationships. Passion and commitment are aspects of fatuous love. There's no intimacy, and the commitment is very premature. Partners rarely talk seriously or share their ideas. They focus on their intense physical attraction, and yet one or both is also talking about making a long-lasting commitment. Sometimes this is out of the sense of insecurity and a desire to make sure the partner is locked into a relationship. Then we have empty love. This type of love may be found later in relationships or in a relationship that was formed to meet needs other than intimacy or passion. So money, child rearing, even status. Here the partners are committed to staying in the relationship, maybe because of the children, maybe because of religious reasons, maybe because there's no other alternatives left. But they don't share their feelings, they don't share their ideas with each other. They have no physical attraction to each other anymore. Then there's romantic love. This is intimacy and passion. They are the main components of romantic love. There is no commitment. So partners spend much time with one another and they enjoy their closeness, but they have not made plans to continue their relationship. This may be true because they are not in a position to make such commitments, or because they're looking for passion and closeness and they're afraid it will die out before a commitment is made. Then we have companionate love. So intimacy and commitment are the hallmarks of companionate love. Partners love and respect one another, and they are committed to stay together, but their physical attraction may have never been strong, or they may have just died out. This may be interpreted as just the way things are, after so much time together. There may even be a sense of regret and loss. Partners are still good friends. They're still committed to one another, though. And then consummate love. It contains all three: love, intimacy, intimacy, passion, and commitment. This is the idea type of love. The couple shares passion. The spark has not died. The closeness is there. They will feel like best friends as well as lovers, and they are committed to staying together. My thoughts on this, most people that get married start out in consummate love. They have the intimacy, they have the passion, they have the commitment, and you can stay in this for a long time. But I think it does die out. Yes, you can get it back later in life, but I think it dies out. You're not always going to have that passion for one another. The intense sexual feelings for one another. You may not always have that intimacy. You may not always feel close. You may not have that affection toward one another. Children get in the way. If you have children, that kind of brings it down sometimes. I think most people start out in that consummate love. They are there. They are all together. And somehow down the road, it changes. As I think, especially with having kids, it definitely changes. That you may not be in that consummate love. Things happen in life. Things happen to attraction. Things happen at work. Things happen in life in general. So it can move to different levels, or they're not really levels, but it can move up and down the chart, if you will. But yes, I think maybe even later, like if your kids leave out of the house, you can definitely get that consummate love back. Doesn't always happen, but I think there's a fluctuation in loves and how it works and when it works that way. Another factor that influences adult interpersonal attraction stems from childhood. There's growing evidence that our early attachments to caregivers can have lasting impact on how we relate to others. Studies of dating couples have identified secure, avoidant, and ambivalent attachment patterns similar to those seen in early childhood. About 60% of all adults have secure attachment, 25% are avoidant, and 10% are ambivalent. So, what is your attachment style? Here's some statements that describe the styles. So, first one, secure. So, I think most often other people are well intentioned and trustworthy. I find it relatively easy to get close with others, and I'm comfortable relying on others. The second attachment style is avoidant. So these people would tend to say, I tend to pull back when things don't go well in a relationship. I'm somewhat skeptical about the idea of true love. I get a little nervous if anyone gets too close emotionally. And then the third one is ambivalent. They would often say, I have often felt misunderstood and unappreciated in my romantic relationships. My friends and lovers have been somewhat unreliable. I would like to be closer to my romantic partner, but I'm not sure if I trust him or her. So we use early attachment experience to build mental models about affectionate relationships. Later, we use these models for forming, maintaining, and breaking the bonds of love and affection. Let's move on to evolution and mate selection. So evolutionary psychology is the study of evolutionary origins of human behavior patterns. Many psychologists believe that evolution left an imprint on people that influences everything from sexual attraction to jealousy, all the way to divorce. David Buss said that the key to understanding human mating patterns is to understand how evolved behavior patterns guide our choices. So in a study of 37 cultures on 6 continents, Buss found out these patterns. Compared with women, men are more interested in casual sex. They prefer younger, more physically attractive partners. They get more jealous over real or imagined sexual infidelities than they do over a loss of emotional commitment. And 2, compared with men, women prefer slightly older partners who appear to be hardworking, higher in status, or economically successful. Women are more upset by a partner who become emotionally involved with someone else, rather than one who is sexually unfaithful. So why do these differences exist? Buss and others believe that mating preferences evolved in a response to the differing reproductive challenges faced by men and women. Women must invest more time and energy in reproduction and nurturing their young than men. Women evolved in an interest in whether their partners will stay with them and whether their mates have the resources to provide for their children. The reproductive success of men depends on their mate's fertility. Men tend to look for healthy young beauty in a mate due to reproductive status. Do you agree with this? So I asked my husband, I said, if you knew this before we got married, or even now, if I could not have any kids, would you have divorced me? And he basically said, probably so. He probably would not have stayed married with me if I was infertile. He wanted kids. That was his thing that he wanted in life. He wanted kids, and he wanted someone to marry that could have kids. And so my thought was, oh, I don't care. There's always adoptions. There's always other alternatives. But his thought was not that. His thought is that he wanted his own kids, and he wanted someone that could reproduce in that status. And so yeah, he would have divorced me. He would have broke up with me when we were dating if I had told him I could not have kids. I've asked this to some of my other classes. If we were face to face, I would ask you. But last semester I asked, and I found out that was the trend. A lot of men said, yeah, they would break up with their girlfriends if they were infertile or knew that they were infertile, because they wanted kids. One girl told me that she definitely, that was in her life plan, was to have kids, and so if her husband or boyfriend could not have kids, then they would break up. So yeah, that definitely that fits the evolutionary selection. That fits the evolutionary and mate selection. There is some evidence that supports the evolutionary view of mating, but there are other factors involved with mating. Some mating patterns may simply reflect the fact that men still tend to be in control of the power and resources in most societies. Early research may be misleading because women tend to give polite answers to questions about jealousy. Privately, women may be just as furious about mates' sexual infidelity as any man would be. So, potential mates are rated as most attractive if they are kind, secure, intelligent, and supportive. Let's move on to helping others. So it's understandable to act kindly toward people that we are attracted to, or friends, or our family. But what about total strangers? There are awards given out every year to heroes that are mainly men. Why are they mainly men? Perhaps because physical dangers that might be involved. Other heroic acts are performed by men and women. Heroic acts are pro-social acts that save lives and involves personal risk, like the Peace Corps or Doctors Without Borders volunteers. There are many women as men involved with these pro-social acts, but do we always help? So in one example, in 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York City. According to the media, around 38 people watched her as her attacker attacked her repeatedly, but nobody offered any assistance. Psychological research inspired by the Kitty Genovese murders there was a lot of research done after the effect. This is called the bystander effect. It is the unwillingness of bystanders to help or to offer help during emergencies. Failures to help is related to number of people present. Over the years, many studies have shown that when more people are present, the less likely people are there to help. So we are likely to assume that someone else will help because there's more people around. Personal responsibility for helping is spread so thin that no one takes action. And I want to show you a video of the bystander effect. If you have any questions on the video, please let me know, but here's the video.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help. Help me, sir. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit flinky, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
Do you want to sit up? You alright, yeah? What's wrong?
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm alright.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group, everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
So people must pass through 4 decisions before giving help. So first, they must notice that there's something happening. What if you faint on the sidewalk? Would someone notice you? It is suggested that the sidewalk is crowded. Few people will even see you. This has little to do with people blocking each other's vision. It is related to the widely accepted norm against staring at people in public. People in crowds typically keep their eyes to themselves. So in this one study done, students were asked to fill out a questionnaire either alone or in a room full of people. As the students worked, a thick cloud of smoke was blown into the room through a vent. Most students left in a room alone noticed the smoke immediately. Few of the people in the groups noticed the smoke until it became difficult to see through it. The participants in a room full of people kept their eyes to themselves. Those alone scanned the room from time to time. So first we have to notice that something is happening. Then we must define the event as emergency. So with the smoke-filled room shows the influences others have on defining the situation as an emergency. When participants in the groups finally noticed the smoke, they tended to glance at others in the room. They were apparently searching for clues to help interpret what was happening. No one wanted to overreact about the smoke in the room. And then they have to take responsibility. This is probably the most crucial step in helping. Group limits help by causing a diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is spreading responsibility among several people during emergencies or to become involved in other problems. It is the feeling that no one is personally responsible for helping. Finally, the last step is to take course of action. So helping behavior is complex and influences by many variables. Regardless of the risk involved with helping, many studies suggest that when we see a person in trouble, it tends to cause a heightened arousal. It is keyed up feeling that can be motivated to give aid, but only if the rewards of helping outweigh the cost. The potential helpers may feel empathetic arousal, which means they empathize with the person in need or feel some of the person's pain, fear, or anguish. Helping is much more likely when we are able to take the perspectives of others and feel sympathy for their unfortunate situation. Empathetic arousal is likely to motivate helping when the person in need seems to be similar to ourselves. A feeling of connection to the victim may be one of the most important factors in encouraging help. Being in a good mood, or feeling successful, feeling happy, or having a feeling of being fortunate also increases helping. When we do help someone, we perceive ourselves as a helpful person. I always ask my students, especially the girls, if you were in downtown Dallas or downtown Houston, would you help a person on the sidewalk if you are alone? You have to be very cautious nowadays. Back then, you could probably help everyone and anyone. Nowadays, you have to be cautious. You don't know if they're pretending. You don't know if they have a weapon on them or anything else on them that might hurt you or kill you. So you have to be very cautious of people nowadays. The best thing to do would be go ahead and call 911 if you feel like there's something going on and you feel like they need help. The best thing to do is call 911, not even to really get close to the person on the sidewalk or ground or wherever. Just to call 911, kind of stay in the vicinity of where they're at and make sure that 911 gets there and helps them out. That would be my best advice. You just have to be careful of people nowadays. So moving on to Module 73, Antisocial Behavior. Antisocial behavior is any behavior that has a negative impact on another person. We humans are capable of hatred and cruelty, as well as being loving and having kindness. Aggression refers to any action carried out with the intention of harming another person. The human capacity for aggression is very staggering. More than 180 million humans were killed by other humans in the 20th century. That's an average of nearly one person every 18 seconds. Aggression is shown in war, riots, family violence, rape, assault, and etc. Bullying is defined as any behavior that deliberately and repeatedly exposes a person to negative consequences or negative experiences. Bullies tend to deal with everyday situations by resorting to aggression. It can be verbal, like name calling, insults, teasing, or physical, like hitting or pushing. And it can be direct, like in your face, or even indirect, like spreading rumors. Male bullies are more likely to engage in direct physical aggression than females. Female bullies tend to use indirect verbal aggression. Bullying is worldwide and it occurs among all age groups and all settings. It can even be found online, cyberbullying. Childhood bullying can have long-term consequences for both the bully and the victim. Teen and adult bullying can lead to serious violence, including murder and suicide. So, what is the biology of aggression? Some theorists say that humans are naturally aggressive. We have a killer instinct from our animal ancestors. So this is kind of appealing, but not all psychologists agree about that we have a killer instinct from our animal ancestors. Some psychologists say that aggression does not have biological roots. Physiological studies have shown that some brain areas are capable of triggering or ending aggressive behaviors. Researchers have found a relationship between aggression and physical factors like low blood sugar, allergies, alcohol and drug abuse, and specific brain injuries. High levels of testosterone may be associated with more aggressive behaviors for both men and women. A few studies show that alcohol is involved in a large percentage of murders and violent crimes. None of these biological factors can be considered the only cause of aggression. Humans are fully capable of learning aggressive behaviors as well. One of the most widely accepted explanations of aggression is the social learning theory. It states that we learn to be aggressive by observing aggression in others. This theory combines cognitive processes, socialization, and modeling to explain the behavior. There is no instinct human programming to start fistfights, gun loading, or other aggressive behaviors. Aggression must be learned. These theorists predict that people growing up in non-aggressive cultures will themselves be non-aggressive. Vice versa with the aggressive cultures. The United States is considered one of the more violent countries. Over 1 million violent crimes happened in the U.S. in 2014. But the crime rate has dropped over 15% in the last decade. Over 40% of U.S. households at least own one firearm. So how can parents reduce aggression in children? You can create a safe, warm environment at home and school. Model the positive ways for getting along in the world. Limit total media time. Don't use media as a babysitter. Closely monitor what your child does experience. Change channels if you object. So if they're watching something bad on TV, something violent, change the channels. Don't let them take over. Explore their media with your child so they can encounter what is shown. So you can encounter what is shown. Help your child to distinguish what's real and what is fantasy. My kids love watching violent shows. They like watch my husband like playing Apex and stuff. And I'm always telling them that, this is fantasy. This is not real. This is not what life is like. This is not what we do in life. And so you have to distinguish between what is real and what is fantasy. I don't have a slide for this, but I want to show you, it's about prejudice. I want to show you a video about discrimination and prejudice before we go on to Module 74. So let's watch this video together.
In February 1999, 4 New York City police officers were on patrol in the Bronx when they saw a young black man standing on a stoop. They thought he looked suspicious. When they pulled over, he retreated into the doorway and began digging in his pocket. He kept digging as the police shouted at him to show his hands. A few seconds later, the man, Amadou Diallo, a 23-year-old immigrant from Guinea, was dead, hit by 19 of the 41 bullets that the police fired at him. What Diallo was reaching for was his wallet. He was going for his ID as he stood on the steps of his own apartment building. Diallo's story and the officer's fatal prejudgment of him is recounted in Malcolm Gladwell's 2005 bestseller, Blink. Gladwell and the social psychologist whose work he draws upon explores Diallo's case as an example of that gray area between deliberate violence and an accident, propagated by non-conscious or implicit biases. The officers did discriminate against Diallo, but the prejudice they acted on may have been driven by something more subtle than simple hatred. And that's an important thing to think about. Yes, there are lots of overtly bigoted people and policies at work all over the world, but what we're interested in today is the more insidious, non-conscious, automatic bias, and how it can affect our behavior. The fact is, our implicit biases affect the way we relate to others in a very real way. Our race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation can make the difference between whether we get a job or not, a fair paycheck or a good rental, or whether we get randomly pulled over or shot and killed for reaching for a wallet. In the last two episodes, we've examined how we think about and how we influence one another, but social psychology is also about how we relate to one another. Like what factors might cause us to help another person, or harm them, or fear them? What are the social and cognitive and emotional roots of prejudice, racism, and sexism, and how do they shape our society? These are some of the aspects of ourselves that are the hardest and most uncomfortable for us to explore, which is why they're so important to understand. We've all been unfairly judged in our time, and let's not pretend that we haven't done our fair share of uninformed judging too. Like it or not, prejudice is a common human condition. Prejudice just means prejudgment. It's an unjustified, typically negative attitude toward an individual or group. Prejudicial attitudes are often directed along the lines of gender, ethnic, socioeconomic status, or culture. And by definition, prejudice is not the same thing as stereotyping or discrimination, although the three phenomena are intimately related. People may distrust a female mechanic. That's a prejudicial attitude, but it's rooted in a stereotype or overgeneralized belief about a particular group. Although it's often discussed in a negative way, stereotyping is really more of a general cognitive process that doesn't have to be negative. It can even be accurate at times. Like, I have the stereotype that all crows have wings, injuries and birth defects aside, and that happens to be true. But on the negative end, your prejudice against female mechanics may be rooted in some inaccurate stereotype about women's skills with a socket wrench. And when stereotypical beliefs combine with prejudicial attitudes and emotions like fear and hostility, they can drive the behavior we call discrimination. So a prejudiced person won't necessarily act on their attitude. Say you believe in the stereotype that overweight people are lazy. You might then feel a prejudiced distaste when you see someone who appears overweight. But if you act on your prejudice and say refuse to hire them for a job or don't let them sit at your lunch counter, then you've crossed over into discriminating against them. The former apartheid system of racial segregation in South Africa, the Nazis' mass killing of gypsies, Jewish people, and other groups, and centuries of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics are all extreme examples of violent prejudice and discrimination. The good news is that in many cultures, certain forms of overt prejudice have waned over time. For example, in 1937, only 1/3 of Americans said that they'd vote for a qualified woman to be president, while in 2007, that figure was up to nearly 90%. But of course, more subtle prejudices can still linger. In the past, we've talked about dual process theories of thought, memory, and attitudes, and that while we're aware of our explicit thoughts, our implicit cognition still operates under the radar, leaving us clueless about its effect on our attitudes and behavior. In the same way, prejudice can be non-conscious and automatic. And I mean, it can be so non-conscious that even when people ask us point blank about our attitudes, we unwillingly or unknowingly don't always give them an honest answer. Do you think that men are better at science than women, or that Muslims are more violent than Christians, or that overweight people are unhealthy? Our tendency to unwittingly doctor our answers to questions like these is why we have the implicit association test, or IAT. The test was implemented in the late 1990s to try to gauge the implicit attitudes, identities, beliefs, and biases that people are unwilling or unable to report. You can take the IAT online and measure your implicit attitudes in all kinds of topics, from from race, religion, and gender to disability, weight, and sexuality. It's basically a timed categorization task. For example, the age-related IIT looks at implicit attitudes about older versus younger people. In it, you might be shown a series of faces, old and young, and objects, pleasant and unpleasant, like pretty flowers versus a pile of garbage. You're then asked to sort these pictures, so you'd press the left key if you see a young face or a pleasant object, and press the right key if you see an old face or an unpleasant object. That's the stereotypic condition. Your keystrokes correspond to stereotypical pairs, in this case associating good stuff with youth and bad stuff with older age. Then the test asks you to do the same thing in a counter-stereotypic condition, pressing the left key if you see a young face or an unpleasant object, and the right key if you see an old face or a pleasant object. The core of the test is your reaction time. Are you faster at sorting when you're working with a stereotypical pairing than you are with counter-stereotypical pairings? If that's the case, even though you may think you're unprejudiced, you've got an implicit association between youth and goodness, which, as you might guess, may have some implications about how you think and act toward older people. The test is widely used in research, and contrary to what some critics think, it's surprisingly predictive of discriminatory behavior in all kinds of experimental settings. So that's one way to measure subtle, implicit prejudice, but obviously overt prejudice is far from dead. That's why discrimination studies are prominent in social psychology research, and they can also predict, sometimes with scary accuracy, how discrimination might show up in broad social patterns, like wage inequality and job opportunity gaps. For instance, a 2012 study led by Yale social psychologist Corinne Moss-Rakusin demonstrated that science faculty across the country systematically discriminated against female science students. In a double-blind study, a representative sample of science faculty members were asked to hire a fictional student applicant for a lab manager job. When the applicant's name was Jennifer instead of John, they viewed her as less competent, were less likely to hire her, offered her less money, and were less likely to mentor her. And this prejudice was even exhibited by women faculty members. And that's an important point. People on both sides of the stereotype tend to respond similarly, with the subjects of prejudice themselves often holding the same stereotypical implicit attitudes or engaging in the same discriminatory behavior. So when we say that stereotypes are pervasive, we mean pervasive. Now, it's all too easy to hold up examples of how people are prejudiced, but the real root of the issue is why they are. Here are a few possibilities. For one, prejudices can come up as a way of justifying social inequalities. This happens when people on both sides of the power and wealth spectrum start believing that people get what they deserve, and they deserve what they get. This is called the just world phenomenon. Prejudices can also be driven by the us versus them, or as social psychologists often call it, the in-group, out-group phenomenon. Whether you're in a soccer stadium or the political arena or school lunchroom or, in the comments of this video, dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups definitely drives prejudice and discrimination. But an in-group identity also gives its members the benefits of communal solidarity and a sort of safety in numbers. This in-group bias, or tendency to favor your own group at the expense of others, is powerful even when it's totally irrational. One common social psychology exercise on in-group favoritism involves dividing a class into two arbitrary groups, say those wearing sneakers and those not wearing sneakers. Each person sits with his or her group and is told to list the differences between themselves and the opposing group. The lists usually start out pretty tame, but become more strident as they grow longer. Eventually, you have sneaker-wearing kids saying that they're just smarter than the people without sneakers, or kids who don't have sneakers say that the others are trashy and low class. Soon enough, each group has inflated itself and derided the opposing group, even though the division between the two was essentially meaningless to begin with. Little exercises like this illustrate the power of any in-group, out-group distinction in creating conflict between groups, and that brings us to the psychological nature of conflict itself. History is littered with examples of how the us versus them mentality has fueled violence and warfare, which is exactly what we'll be talking about next time.
So moving on to Module 74, this is the last module, and we're just going to highlight what it says. It's about teamwork. So a team is a special kind of group. In a team, we rely on others to work on their part while we work on our part. It usually has common goal or project at the end of the teamwork. Psychological research has suggested that effective teamwork has several skills. It has communication, it has leadership, it has problem solving, it has working with diverse others, it has creativity, it has emotional intelligence, and it has creativity or integrity. So how do we become a team player? There are 4 different rules on how to become a team player. We can help create ground rules, set up the norms that team members understand, and agree with what is important and ensuring all members of the team understand what is expected out of them. We can help ensure that everyone participates. We can ask for everyone's opinion about the project or ask everyone to share their goals before making a decision. And we need to show their guidelines to help people know exactly what to do. So don't assume that everyone knows what to do. You need to share what you know so that everyone begins on the same page. So you want to share exactly what they need to be doing, what another person needs to be doing, what you're going to be doing. It will run much more smoothly if everyone is on the same page as you. And then model the behavior you want to see. You should treat people in the way you would want to be treated. You should be open. You should be reliable. You should be acceptance. If that's what is important on your team, that's what you want to demonstrate. You want to show those characteristics to the other team members of the team. If you have any questions, that was just a quick highlight of teamwork and how we become a team player. If you have any questions over anything of this chapter, please let me know. I know it was a very long chapter, but thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.